Hi everyone, it's Miss Caroline. Today I'm going to be going over Lesson 2, Early Farmers, which is in our first unit of social studies. So before we get into it, I'm going to go over the vocabulary terms that are going to show up in this passage that we have to read. All right, so our first term is technology. So today we might think about technology as iPhones and laptops and things like that. But back in the Stone Age, they didn't have any kind of thing like that. So technology just refers to the way in which humans produce the items they use. So how humans made the items that they used to farm or to use as weapons, things like that, whatever they used in their day-to-day life. The next term is domesticate. Domesticate means to tame wild animals or cultivate plants for human use. So there used to be hunters and gatherers, and here's my cat saying hello. There used to be hunters and gatherers, and remember we learned in lesson 1 that the hunters would follow the animals from place to place to hunt them. So they weren't able to settle in one area and make a home. So they had to follow the animals for food. We're going to learn about when the first humans learned how to domesticate animals. So they were able to keep the animals right where they were so they could stay in one spot. So if we think of farming today, the animals are in one spot and we can use them for milk, eggs, meat, things like that. So during this time, during the New Stone Age, as we're going to learn about, that's when humans first were able to do that. And they did the same thing for plants. So they were also able to domesticate plants. So they were able to collect seeds and have their plants grow in one area so they didn't have to go out into the wilderness searching for the plants that they wanted to eat. All right, the next one is harvest, which means to gather crops. And a lot of you guys like to play that game on Facebook where you have your own little farm. And the little tool that you get out when you're going to collect the crops that you grew, it was called your harvest tool. So that just means, harvest just means that you're gathering the crops that you grew. An excavation site, we talked about this a little bit in lesson 1. An excavation site is where archaeologists dig up artifacts. So it's a location where they can find a lot of artifacts that early humans left behind. So that's where you'll see them digging and carefully brushing off dirt off of items to try to find artifacts and learn more about early civilizations. Our next one is agriculture, which is the raising of plants and animals for human use. So an easy way to remember this is agriculture is the same thing as farming. Okay. And our next one is surplus, which is an extra supply. Surplus is an extra supply. So once they were able to domesticate animals and grow plants in one area, they were able to make a surplus of food and supplies. So they didn't have to all make their own food. They could start to distribute jobs to other people or sell their surplus to other people to make some money. A nomad is a person who travels from place to place. So the early people were nomads in that they would follow their animals for food. They had to follow them and hunt them. They hadn't domesticated animals yet. So a nomad is just a person who travels from place to place. They're not staying in one spot. A social division is the different roles that people have in society. So another term for this is simply jobs. So once we learned to domesticate animals and plants, we had this surplus of food. So we could start giving out jobs. We could divide up society into these social divisions. So one group of people could raise the animals, another group of people could raise the plants, and another group of people could make the tools and weapons and so on. So social division is just the same thing as a job. The climate is the average weather conditions in an area over a long period of time. And carbon dating is a method of judging the age of things that lived long ago. So scientists will look at the carbon that are in these things, in these artifacts, and they can try to guess as to how old that thing is based on how much carbon is left inside of it. All right, so before we get reading, let's review what our questions are going to be. So our first one is going to be a sequence. And remember, I always say it's a little bit silly that this is the first question because we really can't do this question until we've read the whole thing. Because we're not going to know the order that these events happened until we read the entire passage. Number 2 is what characteristics defined the Stone Age? So it looks like this whole passage is going to be about the Stone Age and some of the characteristics that defined it. So we're going to hold off on doing number 2 until the end as well. Number 3, what is domestication? Okay, so we talked about this a little bit already. It's one of our key vocabulary terms right here. And we're also going to be talking about it down here. So let's wait and read a little bit more about it before we answer that one. And the next one, Indy wants to do it. Number 4 is, how did farming crops and raising animals change how people lived? Use the terms social division and agriculture in your answer. So we talked about that a little bit too, and we're going to be learning more about that. It looks like just from skimming, we're going to probably be learning about it a little bit in the domestic animals and maybe the village life paragraphs, okay? So already I know where I'm going to be looking for those answers. And our last one, our critical thinking question, is focused on making inferences. And the question is, how can we know what animals Stone Age people domesticated? Okay? So usually the critical thinking ones, they're not going to come right out and tell us, but I think we can get some hints from this last paragraph. All right, so let's start out. The Stone Age. The Stone Age was a prehistoric time when people used mostly stone tools. All right, so that makes sense. Stone Age, stone tools. The Stone Age is divided into 2 periods, the Old Stone Age and the New Stone Age. The Old Stone Age lasted a long time. Little progress was made in technology. So even though it lasted a long time, they weren't making any new discoveries. They weren't progressing very much. They were just kind of using their old stone tools. So little progress was made in technology. Technology is the way humans produce the items they use. People used mostly stone tools, but they also used wood, horn, antler, and bone tools. During the New Stone Age, humans greatly improved their technology in a shorter period of time. People began using polished rock as a tool. Humans began to farm. They also started to domesticate or tame wild animals. So by domesticating these wild animals, they were able to start farming. Okay, so let's learn a little bit more about early farming. Grains were among the first plants humans farmed. Artifacts found in excavation sites tell archaeologists about the crops that were harvested or gathered. And remember, whenever it says or right after like a new big word, right here, or domesticate or tame, this or tells you that the next word is going to mean the same thing as this word. So domesticate means tame. Harvested means gathered. Okay? All right. Domesticate or domestic animals. And remember, an answer to one of our questions is going to be somewhere in here probably. People began domesticating wild animals about 10,000 years ago. Some animals were used for food, clothing, and shelter. Stronger animals, such as cattle, were used for plowing fields. In this way, domesticated cattle helped agriculture develop. Agriculture is the raising of plants and animals for human use. Families were now able to raise more crops than they needed. They could sell the surplus or the extra supply. So same thing here. This or means that surplus means extra supply. All right. So, what is domestication? So, we should be looking back in our paragraph, and we actually kind of get the answer right up here. This talks a little bit more about the animals that were domesticated, but our definition for domesticate is right up here. So domesticate is taming wild animals. And if we remember, if we looked up in our definition of domesticate up here, it could mean also taming or cultivating plants. And the reason that we do this is for human use, for humans to use for food. We learned in our textbook today that they also use some of the plant fibers to make baskets or rope or nets so that they could fish. And then same thing for animals. So they could domesticate the animals for food or to make clothing with the skin and fur, or also to use like some of the stronger, bigger animals to help plow fields and help agriculture. So what is domestication? So we would start out our sentence. Domestication is, and we can get this right here. So notice how here the word is domesticate, and here it's domestication. So when we answer this question, we're going to use this definition, but we need to change tame to taming. So domestication is the taming of wild animals or cultivation of plants and for human use. So that's how we would change it so that it still makes sense with domestication as opposed to the vocabulary term domesticate. All right. Now we're going to be looking for number 4, which is how did farming crops and raising animals change how people lived? Use the terms social division and agriculture in your answer. So we've already learned a little bit about this. Because down here, families were now able to raise more crops than they needed. So they had a surplus. Because everything was right there and they didn't have to go chasing after the animals or searching for the plants. They were able to raise a surplus and they were able to sell what they didn't need. All right. And remember, we have to use the terms agriculture and social division. So agriculture, that's when they raised plants and animals. Right? So once they were able to tame the plants and animals, they could raise them in one spot, which is called agriculture. And then they didn't have to move around, so they were able to make a surplus of that food. But our answer can't be done yet because we haven't used social divisions in it yet. So we're going to have to wait until we get down here. Okay? More useful creatures. Nomads were people who migrated from place to place. They domesticated animals such as horses, donkeys, and camels. These animals helped them travel great distances. So see, they move from place to place. They're not staying in one spot. But they still did domesticate some animals, but those animals that they used to help them travel further in a shorter period of time. Right. Village life. Skara Brae was a typical Stone Age village. Some people in the village were farmers and herders. Others were tool makers. Still others harvested fish and shellfish. Because of the food surplus, the extra supply, the village was able to divide up the work. This formed social divisions or different roles given to different people in a society. Their lifestyle changed from hunting and gathering to farming. Okay? So basically, if we want to think about it, so we domesticated animals, so domestication happened. We domesticated plants and animals, which led to, after we domesticated them, we were able to raise them in one spot, which is called agriculture or farming. And then, because we were farming in one spot, we had all this extra supply or surplus of food. And then we were like, okay, well, we don't all have to make a ton of food, and then we just have a lot of waste. So then we could divide up the work. Divide up the work in social divisions. So that's how that progression happened. So to restate here, farming crops and raising animals changed how people lived because, and you have to make sure you have social division and agriculture in your answer. So we talked a lot about that, and you can use this little progression to help you. Okay, and our last paragraph. The Iceman. Archaeologists also study how early people lived in different climates. In 1991, people found the frozen body of a man in Europe. Archaeologists studied the Iceman's copper axe and stone knife. They believed he lived during or after the New Stone Age. Archaeologists knew that copper was used during the New Stone Age. They also used a method called carbon dating to help them judge how old the man was. He lived about 5,300 years ago. Okay. So in this last paragraph, we learned a little bit about how archaeologists figured out the age of this Iceman that they found that was alive during the New Stone Age. And this question for number 5, we're making an inference. We talked about that in ELA. We're making an educated guess based on the information that we have. How can we know what animals Stone Age people domesticated? So we're going to use the clues that we get down in here to make an inference about how scientists guess what animals Stone Age people domesticated. So to restate, we can learn what animals Stone Age people domesticated. By, and then you're going to put your answer. Okay? So now that we've done this whole thing, now we can look back at questions 1 and 2. And in talking about number 4, we kind of went over the sequence of how these things happened. So you should be able to sequence them in chronological order. So chronological order is the order in which they happened. So you're going to put a number 1 for the first thing that happened, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 for the order in which they happened. So the options are domesticated crops, social divisions within a community, production of surplus food, domesticated animals, and technology improves. So we talked a lot about that. So you should be able to look back and figure this one out. And number 2, what characteristics define the Stone Age? Characteristics are things that describe it, what was common during that. If we're talking about your own characteristics, you might say a characteristic of yourself is that you have brown eyes or that you're kind. So when we're talking about characteristics of the Stone Age, what kinds of things were happening that kind of can define it? So one thing we should know for sure in the name, the Stone Age, what kind of tools did they have? They had mostly stone tools. That's one characteristic that defines the Stone Age. Okay? So that's one of them. See what else you can remember and look back and find evidence of what Stone Age people did or had during the Stone Age. So you're going to do that for number 2. So this is part of your answer for number 2. And to restate, you will say characteristics that defined the Stone Age are, and I'll even put the first one for you, are they used mostly stone tools, and then you'll put a comma, and then you'll list your items, and after each item you list, each characteristic you list, you'll do a comma, and then before your last item, you'll put an and then you'll put your final characteristic. All right, I hope this helps you with your Lesson 2 homework. Don't forget that it's due this Friday, October 11th. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments below or ask me before or after class. Bye, guys.